Welcome to Out of the Question, a podcast that looks behind some common questions and uncovers the question behind the question while providing real solutions for biblical world and life view. Your host is Andrea Schwartz, a teacher and mentor and founder of the Chalcedon Teacher Training Institute.
Thanks for joining me again today. The internet is so much a part of our lives these days, and many users are concerned, rightfully so, that their ability to express their views and communicate freely and do business are eroding and will continue to do so. So, is all lost? Is this the trajectory we have to be headed on? Well, my guest today is a Christian man who is working to create as free an internet as possible. His name might not be familiar to you, but rest assured you have encountered his influence. Robert Monster is the founder and CEO of Epik and managing director of Monster Venture Partners. Rob has over 2 decades of experience in technology-enabled services to the global market research industry. Prior to that, Rob worked with Procter & Gamble in a global capacity, taking him throughout Europe, Asia, North America, and Latin America. He is a Dutch American, fluent in 3 languages, English, Dutch, and German. He has both a Bachelor of Science and an MBA from Cornell University. And on top of that, he's also an author, a husband, and a father. Rob Monster came to my attention when I asked Chalcedon Vice President Martin Salbretti for suggestions for people I should interview for this podcast. He sent me to a video of a lecture Rob Monster gave a couple of years ago at the Future of Christendom conference entitled Tech Communications, Answering the Call in a Digital Age. Rob, I am honored and so grateful that you agreed to this interview.
Well, Andrea, I'm happy to join you. Thank you for hosting.
In that video I referenced, you discussed how you came to hear and answer the call of Almighty God on your life. I think that's a good place to start.
Well, absolutely. I certainly didn't grow up with particularly strong faith or foundation of spiritual understanding. I was raised in a household that you would characterize probably as atheist, although my mother's mother was a Bible-believing Christian and oftentimes could be seen in the evening reading scripture. So really, I didn't have the advantage, as many of your listeners have, of growing up in a Christian household. That came rather organically. And I have to say that I was rather late in coming to Christ. Really, when I was, the year I turned 40 was the year that really I began to question why the world works the way that it was, and was led through a process of trying to understand many facets without really any party bias, so to speak. But ultimately, after a lengthy and filling, as I said, 2 libraries with books of all types, came to the certain conclusion that Satan is real and Jesus Christ is Lord. Not only should conclude that Satan is real, but Jesus Christ is Lord, but that because God is all-knowing and all-powerful, I should rest in his finished work and surrender my body as a vessel to be used for his purpose. And that was on February 5th, 2014. And I haven't looked back since.
Well, praise God for that. Now, you mentioned that you had a lot of years growing up and in your adult life prior to what we would typically call your conversion. But you were a successful man before that, were you not?
Oh, absolutely. I was an extremely industrious kid. As a child, being the only male grandchild, and my mother's father had no sons. He had 3 daughters, and he ran a family farm in northern Holland, a commercial farm that had been in the family for many generations. And so already as a young child, starting around age 6 or 7, I was sent every year to work the entire summer on the farm in the Netherlands. And I would work alongside people who were between 18 and 25, farm workers. And I would my very level best to keep up with them and make just as much money as they would make. And so at a very young age was, kind of mature beyond my years from an industriousness standpoint. I wouldn't give it the characterization of being wisdom, but I was certainly industrious. And that carried on throughout my whole life. I've always been an industrious guy, always a little bit on the serious side, and trying to get more done in a day than should be reasonably possible, and not being too easily daunted.
Right. Now, what's very interesting is there are some ways that people will look at anyone's life and try to disregard everything that happened prior to their coming to know the Lord in the way you described. But once you understand that our days have been ordained from before we were even conceived, we realize that God puts certain traits in us, certain interests, certain capabilities that is the preparation for what he will do with us, and as a result, how we can serve his kingdom. So were you dissatisfied before you started investigating all this because you weren't making enough money or you didn't have good relationships with people? What was the impetus to say, I don't really know what this is all about?
Well, really what it came down to for me was a realization that some aspects of the world were not exactly as advertised. And without going too far down the rabbit hole, I simply believed that some aspects of what we were taught in school and what we were being taught in the media were not an entirely accurate characterization, or maybe were not the complete picture. And so rather than saying definitively, here's the right answer, from a zero-based perspective, began to try to figure out what was the truth. And ironically, as part of that journey, also became studied in matters of occult and Freemasonry and witchcraft and whatever, right? All types of things that were basically what you might characterize as forbidden fruit. Really from the perspective of trying to understand these things that are not generally open in the public discourse. And ultimately I came to the conclusion that Satan is real, but Jesus Christ is Lord. But it really was a process. Mm-hmm. And part of one of the things that I believe you will discover as an overarching thread of the journey that brings us to present day is the recognition that it's very hard to know the truth if you have only half the pieces of the puzzle and you don't know which half. And so I believe it is essential that it become the prerogative of mankind and womankind to give humanity the opportunity to know the truth and to ask questions and seek answers and have a reasonable level of confidence and strength of conviction that you found the truth. And of course, you can then through, let's say, from a spiritual perspective, validate the truth by seeing the power of transformation, to see the impact of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit on somebody being transformed and regenerate from a prior state. But there are still many aspects of, as you know, manifestation of spiritual power through prayer and all manner of intercessory presence in the throne room of heaven. And we get to see that throughout our walk as Christians who have sold out to the kingdom. And for many people who are in a more early stage of their walk, could not even begin to appreciate that these things are even possible.
Well, to kind of validate my point, you were an industrious person, you were inquisitive, you wanted to learn. And when you encountered this question, you sort of continued with the kind of inclination you had. So I guess that was my point, that rather than split anybody's life into just two sections, although we could before we know Christ and afterwards, that we look at the fact that God's plan supersedes what we can comprehend. And so through all that investigation, you could have gone a lot of different ways, but you went to the conclusion that not only were you seeking the truth, but that the truth is a person, Jesus Christ.
Absolutely. And that the truth is essential to the point of being the meaning of life. I would go so far as to say that the meaning of life is very simple, and that is to know the identity of the creator and to know what it is that he wants. And that there's nothing more noble or more worthwhile or foundational as to the reason we get 70 to 80 years on this earth with functioning cognition, to be able to go answer those essential questions.
So you answered these questions, or I would say, if you're like most of us, you're still answering the questions that come up, but you know where to go for the answers. You would think that that kind of epiphany and transformation would make everybody feel very good about you, except if anybody does a little bit of research, there are those who love you and there are those who malign you. Why do you think you got the maligning part so drastically?
Well, I think that the base reason is that we are empowering competing narratives. As a technology provider that has stood in the gap, I believe that I have answered a calling. That calling really came in earnest in the summer of 2018, where I believe that I had an unction, possibly from the throne room of heaven, seems to be, that the Lord would need a registrar, and I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I followed the prompt and heeded the call that the technology that we had developed and had assembled through organic development and acquisition over the previous several years, that technology would play some essential role in empowering people to publish truth, disseminate truth, and discuss the truth. And there are people who find that troubling because they want to control the narrative. And to the extent that technology on a very large scale, internationally speaking, touches billions of people, allowing them to consider what they've been told and weigh it against what they now believe, this can be a rather disruptive force vis-a-vis a status quo that is steeped in ignorance. Right. So that's where I think I have perturbed certain people, some of whom have significant influence and power over media, over big tech, over communications. And unfortunately, it's very hard to control the narrative when somebody determines that it is essential to destroy a person's character.
We'll get to that, but I want to make sure that there are people who are not lost with what is a registrar. You know, why was that so significant that you might have some very powerful and wealthy people dislike you so much?
Well, so a registrar is essentially a utility provider that allows somebody with a domain name, a web presence, to be connected to the internet. So think of it as essentially the core function for anybody who wants to be sovereign on the internet is that they will own a domain name, and that domain name then can be connected to hosting, to email. You can set up web applications, mobile applications, but if you don't have a registrar, then you're not on the internet. And there are only a few hundred registrars that are retail oriented. The biggest one by far is GoDaddy, with more than 60% of the market, a de facto monopolist. And then there are very few that are technically competent. And I would argue that Epik has built the most complete registrar platform that the industry has ever seen. Even though we're smaller than GoDaddy, we were voted the 2020 Registrar of the Year by the leading forum that monitors the domain industry. And we continue to accrue wins despite not having taken significant capital from anybody and not taking any capital from Silicon Valley.
Okay, so why would the average Joe encounter your influence? Because I stated that at the beginning. So maybe 2 years ago, people would not have even understood the term deplatforming, but it's happening quite a lot now. So how does what you do combat this deplatforming?
Well, I think that the reason why people are beginning to become aware that this is a phenomena and something that is a topic of concern is because of what we've just endured in the last election cycle, where there was overt evidence of big tech bias interfering with the ability for certain messages to be heard, and things like deplatforming unpersoning, demonetization, all became kind of part of the popular vernacular in describing the technical strategies that were being used to control narratives. Most recently, in January of 2021, earlier this month, there was a high-profile deplatforming of Parler.com and AR15.com. Parler was deplatformed by Amazon AWS, and AR15.com, the leading portal for gun enthusiasts in America, was deplatformed by GoDaddy. Well, both of those companies moved all of their domains immediately to Epik, not necessarily because they were solicited by us, they were not, but because we are viewed in the industry as being one of the few, if not the only, that has demonstrated the consistent willingness to hold the line on due process. And that started way back in 2018 when we became the registrar of Gab.com, which went through a similar experience. And then many other groups have since joined us. And so you would recognize a number of those different brands that have all converged in one way, shape, or form towards Epik as registrar or host or both. Gab is one, InfoWars, CloudHub, all of Dan Bongino's sites, Steve Bannon's sites. Those names are all coming to Epik or are in the process of coming to Epik. But the list of organizations that you would recognize that have converged on Epik are significant. And what is happening in January 2021 is also an acceleration of Christian-oriented content like Blue Letter Bible moving their assets, and the list goes on in terms of significant Christian ministry organizations and Christian publisher operations that have a significant dependence in a time of COVID on their digital presence. And so the idea that their ability to serve their audiences and be able to participate in dialogue or to even receive funds from a donation perspective, all of those things are dependent on having a resilient digital presence. And we have had the last 2.5 years to refine our competency in building resilient digital presence. And without going too far into the minutiae, I can tell you categorically that we have assembled the most complete technical solution for allowing someone to be resiliently connected to the internet. And that makes us a threat to the extent that anybody questions our discernment as to who do we route and who do we not route.
Right. Like I said, when you do a little bit of research, you're immediately thrown in as a white supremacist, neo-Nazi, blah, blah, blah. But really and truly, your whole platform or your whole orientation is to allow people to speak freely without having to deal with fact checkers and media censors.
Well, that's partly true. I do believe that there is a balance between draconian censorship and responsible moderation. Okay. There are sites that we have opted not to route. Famously, 8chan and Daily Stormer are two sites that we didn't choose to route because we believed that they lacked discernment in terms of allowing certain content that was hateful to allow to stay on the internet and be used to propagate hate. And I would say to you that because I have the opportunity to interact with so many of the different people who are participating in various competing narratives, I also have the opportunity to get to know their hearts and to what extent they are on a path of human empowerment where they ultimately intend to edify their audience, but also to identify those who maybe are not regenerate and are not beyond redemption, right? Because ultimately, who are we to judge? If we look back at history, Saul of Tarsus was one mean guy. I would characterize him as, assassin number one of the Pharisees, and yet he became Paul the Apostle. So how could we go so far as to judge that even somebody who is vile is beyond redemption? And I'll give you an example from just this past week. We had a client who was in the process of selling some domain names, and I I know from one of our staff who did some due diligence on this person that this person actually had a criminal record. And should we cancel his order? And it was about $85,000 transaction. And I said, well, let me look. And then I said, well, let's hold out for the possibility that we're appealing to this man's higher self and that he is getting out of this business because he intends to be something different. And sure enough, that's exactly what was uncovered. This was a person who probably had the opportunity to go one direction or the other, and has chosen to become a new a participant, be reintegrated into civil society and to part ways with his past. And had we not taken that extra moment to consider the possibility that this person is on a journey and that they are leaving some past history, that person might have been stuck in the mire of a past that was holding them back from being the person that God envisioned for them. And I see that over and over again.
Well, that brings me to really what the subject matter was of your talk at that conference. It was all about answering God's call. Now, when God called you to be a registrar, obviously there are implications of that. It has to do with some of the things you just described in having the freedom and opportunity to look beyond what somebody looks like on paper. But would you mind explaining a little bit more about how you feel called into this arena and how you might hope that other people would listen for God's call in this arena?
Well, I think the very first verse that the Lord led me to when I came to Christ and fully grasped what it meant to rest in his finished work and to part from self-righteousness, having spent several years as a would-be Messianic Jew trying to maintain the mitzvot, right? I mean, really, I don't regret having spent time studying those things, but ultimately the ability to move on from that. And that verse was Daniel 12:4. In the times of the end, many shall go to and fro, and knowledge will increase. And this idea that says that in this, shall we say, end time, there is a dramatic acceleration in the ability to ask questions and seek answers on a level that we've not seen before, and I believe is about to accelerate to such a degree that it will be stunning, that in fact we will have digital revival on a worldwide scale that will touch billions, including people who are currently not even connected to the internet, but will be very soon. And that in many ways, the Great Commission will be fulfilled to an accelerated extent by virtue of technology that will empower people to ask questions and seek answers, to find community, and to break down walls. There will be churches without walls. And in fact, I would characterize COVID as not a curse, but a blessing, because it caused the walls to come down. And obviously, Romans 8:28 tells us that all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And we will almost certainly look at this episode that we are currently enduring through eternal eyes and recognize this pestilence, or whatever it happens to be, to have been a catalyst for accelerated review of one's spiritual state on a very significant scale that is in fact accelerating as we go into 2021.
So you sound pretty hopeful. I started off by saying there are a lot of people who are saying, oh, we're going to lose all our liberties. We're going to lose all our freedoms. This is hopeless. There's no way that this is a good scenario unless they think that they're not going to have to face it and live in it and work through it. But you sound hopeful that even people who don't even have electricity or internet right now, that you're talking about having them hear the truth in a way that nobody ever could have imagined.
Absolutely. I have absolute conviction that God is on the throne, that he is for us, that we have the opportunity to fulfill his purpose, that we can do all things through Christ, which strengthens us. And I have seen so much evidence in my own life of answered prayer and being able to overcome what many would characterize as insurmountable odds. I have lived what it means to operate with a mindset of manna, that we don't need to basically be thinking for tomorrow, that we place our works into God's care, that He does order our steps, and that the promises that we see in the Bible are also the corollary to God's expectations, right? God sets expectations and He makes promises. You meet His expectations and He fulfills His promises. And the idea that we can approach the throne room with all manner of care, and know that those problems will to a very great degree be remedied, maybe not in our preferred method, maybe not in our preferred order, but in a way that glorifies Him. And I have seen it time and time and time again. It is absolutely mind-blowing to me why anybody would not completely surrender to God's purpose, based on what I have experienced in my own walk.
But you referenced that you've had to go through some difficulties. And in the lecture that I heard you give, you talked about how your immediate family and your extended family and how the attacks came and some blows were received. Do you mind sharing about that?
Well, I have seen a lot of that, not so much me personally, although some people would say that the media coverage was very hostile towards me and whatever. But I would say that when you make a decision that you care more about what God thinks of you than what man thinks of you, and are willing to basically approach the task through the lens of eternal eyes, that it becomes a whole lot easier to endure the commentary and back chatter of a group of skeptics who don't necessarily share the same vision that I have. But I believe if they too had the opportunity to look at what we're doing through eternal eyes, they would probably agree with us. And in fact, I believe that from a doctrine standpoint, and I think that there is sufficient scriptural support for this, that I can say it. Why is it that it is a blessing to deal with people who curse you, right? Why would that be? Like, what would explain that? What aspect of soul ties or quantum entanglement or whatever you want to call it would explain that it would be a blessing that somebody would hate you wrongly or judge you wrongly? And I believe that ultimately, by the very nature of God's universal design, that it creates the license to pray and intercede for those individuals who wrongly characterize or who speak in judgmental language about who is Epik and who is Rock Monster. And so I have seen hearts change. I have seen people recant wrong statements. And I think that pattern will ultimately be accelerated. And, if you look back at some of the people who have played a role in evangelical transformation through history, Dr. David Livingstone is a model that I have studied, and I'm fascinated by his intrepid work on the African continent. But for quite some time, more than a decade, he was persona non grata in his home country of England, and he had to forsake a great deal. Ultimately, though, we look back on him as being this phenomenal, really remarkable individual who achieved much and even was responsible for the eradication of much of the African slave trade. And the degree to which Africa is to this day substantially a Christian continent, we can almost certainly, to a large degree, lay at his feet. But along the way, he had to endure a great deal of persecution, and God allowed him to endure all of it. So I think we have the benefit of the prior example of many who have walked the hard road to look at and to learn from for the purposes of our own persecution and our own set of challenges in modern times. we have it relatively good. If you would look at it from the perspective of the United States and Western Europe, we're really not suffering too much, other than maybe social rebuke.
Right. Christianity is unique in as much as we're commanded, not suggested, not likely to be a good idea. You're commanded to pray for those who persecute you.
Absolutely.
And what's interesting? If you've lived a very comfortable life, what is that? The person who cut you off or took your parking space. Sometimes I think God turns up the heat so that his people will recognize exactly where they have prioritized incorrectly. So having the opportunity to witness to those who persecute you is exactly what grew the church. They say that the blood of the martyrs grew the church. Well, a martyr is one who gives testimony. And I think that's the thing that we should gravitate towards, in as much as this is an opportunity for us to share the gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do it fearlessly. I do it through my Twitter, username Rob Monster. I do it through our interaction. There are some days where I'll talk to 30 or 40 clients in a day. And I will encourage our own staff, if they have the unction, to take a break from their work and go find their prayer closet and pray for the individual they just encountered. We encourage and invite people, if they feel the unction, to say God bless you at the end of a call. That's all allowed, right? And we don't set an expectation one way or the other. We simply invite people to recognize that we are all on a spiritual journey, and to a large extent, many people are not presented in these times with the type of interactions that can, in fact, be a catalyzing event in their own transformation. And there's a lot of pain and suffering out there. And so if we can be salt and light and treat our entire industry and all the customers that we serve directly and indirectly as a sort of mission field, then just as Paul as a tent maker, or Christ as a carpenter, or Luke as a physician, we can view our respective industry as a sort of mission field. And it just so happens that when you're in the business of empowering the internet, you get to do it on a much larger scale, with many more second order and third order effects than one could have had 2,000 years ago.
You talked about stepping out in faith and receiving the slings and arrows, but it wasn't just against you. I know your wife had issues that she had to deal with. And it's always difficult when one member of a spousal partnership comes to faith. Was she reluctant how did she react to the change in you?
Well, she grew up in a Christian household. Her father's father was a minister, and they had 12 children, and they heard sermons twice a day. So it wasn't like I was on a path of not being equally yoked. But I will say that I made a decision, and make a decision every day, to repudiate all works and all possessions, body, soul, spirit, mind, and leave it all at the altar, recognizing that God is a greater steward of all of these things than I will ever be. And that mindset of forsaking the world is not necessarily the common practice of your typical Christian, and it isn't really the practice of most of the people that are in my family. But I lead by example, and I hope that it inspires others, including people in my own family. And to a large extent, I believe that they're all on a journey, and that there's remarkable transformations happening. Some of it is carrot, and some of it is stick. And the Lord chastens those he loves. And for example, as I mentioned in the video that you referenced at the start of the call, my wife actually had a terrible fall, and it was the day before Mother's Day in 2019. She fell through a spiral staircase and broke her back, lost 2 vertebrae, and smashed her foot in 6 places, and crushed her sternum. And she was, a doctor, fit and healthy. But now all of a sudden, she was laid up, and frankly had a near-death experience because she came within probably a fraction of a centimeter from cracking her neck or having some other lethal outcome. And I believe that it was God's grace that allowed that event to occur, but also that it wasn't for the end. The Lord chastens those He loves, and I do believe that there are events that we encounter that in that immediate moment it seems terribly tragic, but in some ways it then becomes a catalyzing event to become less of this world and more of the eternal. And that unfortunately did happen. And similarly, my wife was the recipient of a groundless lawsuit. But there, once again, the lawsuit became part of her own sanctification journey, where she had to now review the correspondence related to this disgruntled former business partner and see everything through the lens of the person who felt disgruntled. These things are in some ways uncomfortable, but ultimately may bring us to a place of surrender and humility and the desire to love thy neighbor as thyself, not because it's some abstract moral code that cannot be achievable, but because it's the best advice anybody could ever give you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a real calmness in your voice. And a lot of people would think at where you are on the echelon of business and all the responsibility and all that hate that comes your way and all the praise, because you can also be corrupted by the praise you get. It sounds to me like you mean what you say. And by that is that it's a daily surrender, because if people really thought about it, they don't have anything more than today.
Absolutely. Yeah, I view it this way, to treat everybody that comes into my path with compassion and humility. And the result of doing that is you get to see people manifest their higher selves. And I get to see that over and over again. There are people that humanity has discarded. And you look at some of these people who are, say, white nationalists, as they're being called, or people who even, manifest genocidal thoughts. I've had some fascinating interactions with people, in part because of the perception that Epik will provide safe harbor for anything goes free speech. And that's not the truth. We actually will talk to people that others might discard, but part of the reason why we talk to them is because we believe there's an opportunity to appeal to their higher selves, and because a recognition that we're all on a journey, and the audiences that they cater to are also on a journey. So, for example, I did an interview about a year and a half ago, 14 months ago, and it was an interview with a couple of white nationalists. And I didn't really know much about them, but they, knew that we had stood for Gab, and they asked me if I would come on their show. And they were both hidden, but I was, fully on video. And I proceeded to talk with them for almost 2 hours, completely unscripted. And these people would be kind of representative of the type of folks that the liberal media would blaspheme, so to speak, right? Would characterize as being detritus, right? That the world should basically flush them down the toilet and be done. If you can't imprison them, then exterminate them, right? I mean, and that actually is a bit of a miss, right? Because in fact, when we approach these people from a position of compassion and humility and a desire to have a conversation about what can we learn from each other and what can history teach us, that you can change hearts. In the prisons, recidivism rates are 87% over a 9-year period. That's not working very well if 87% of the people you imprison are back in prison within 9 years. But if you change their hearts, and you change their purpose and allow them to find God, you might find that they go on a very different course. And that's what fascinates me about engaging people that others would have given up on.
You know, just take that perspective in any arena of life. The idea that you really trust that whatever happens to you comes from God because he's sovereign, whether he's reproving you or rewarding you. Sometimes that's not as easily seen, but all the things that trouble might bring you to, the person who's trying to collect on something or the person who's angry or whatever it is, by what you said, hearing what they have to say, and then responding with your higher self. Because the truth is, it's easy to fight with people. It's a lot harder to keep your ambassadorship going and saying, I represent Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and I don't typically lead with that, the whole Christ thing. I don't start with that. People know that I'm a Christian. It's not a secret in my industry. But I certainly would not lead with that. I absolutely approach it more from the standpoint of exhibiting really the 7 main things that I will pray for every day: knowledge, wisdom, faith, courage, humility, patience, and charity, believing that those characteristics are all from God. And if you ask for them, then God will supply them. Just as Solomon asked for wisdom and knowledge, and was rewarded with much else. Those sovereign attributes of Christ are all available to the body of Christ, and you can basically fill your lamp with those qualities. And whether you refer to that lamp as oil or Holy Spirit, or by its attributes that are manifest in what it means to be Christ-like, if you show those characteristics in your daily interaction with people and hold out for them to manifest their higher selves from a position of hope, then indeed, I believe you will see it. Right? If you treat a person like a criminal, they'll show you they're a criminal. And if you treat them as somebody who has a higher self, more times than not, they'll exhibit that as well. And I see that all the time, almost every day.
That's great. So you mentioned David Livingstone as having had a profound influence in your life. Are there other notables you'd like to share?
I read a lot of the old Puritan writings over the course of the last couple of years in particular. I've had a great appreciation for the Banner of Truth and their publishing works, and having the opportunity to, go study the old works. And I have a, giant library, 2 libraries really. But I never tire of the works of John Newton and Thomas Halliburton, and go down the list of some of the great Puritan writers. I think that they found something really essential, which is that the life we choose to live and the journey of sanctification that we can choose to undertake by God's grace, that opens up so many possibilities. And I think that the folks that have figured that out and have applied that in their daily walk are largely what made America possible, going back to the 1600s and 1700s, before America became a constitutional republic, and then before America became an incorporation in 1871. We were a Christian nation governed by families who were surrendered to Christ's purpose and indwelt by the Holy Spirit. So I find that the old writers are particularly fascinating in terms of what they all uncovered. They didn't have Netflix, and they didn't have an endless supply of distractions. Their brains were not addled with all manner of pharmakeia. And so they had the good fortune of being able to devote most of their spare time when they weren't providing for their family to be in Scripture and in prayer. And imagine if we had that ability in modern times, in 2021, and imagine if we had not only that ability, but that in fact tens of millions of people around the world became inspired to live with that kind of lifestyle with the objective of doing kingdom work. And I think that's coming. It may already be in progress to a significant degree. And the folks at Chalcedon, who I have gotten to know, I have a high regard for the work that has been done there. So yeah, kudos really to what I see unfolding in the body of Christ, with people who are devoted servants in the kingdom, who recognize the role that is available for them to play and have stepped up and pursued it with courage.
And so that ties in with something that Dr. Rushdoony, who founded Chalcedon, would always say, that his work in uncovering biblical law, so people knew, kind of going back to what you said, once they know the Creator, they end up knowing what he likes and doesn't like, what he wants and he doesn't want, that reconstruction needs to happen in every area of life. And so you're bringing it and have been bringing it, and others as well, in the areas of technology. And when you talk about, possibilities for the future, these are things that will benefit all people, not just believers, just like the Roman roads benefited everybody, but the gospel spread as travel could take place. So can you share at all some of the things you see coming down the road that you might either be working on or others?
Yeah, so we're working on a lot of fascinating things. And if you go to Epik, epik.com/labs, it catalogs all of the different technology initiatives that we are incubating or have acquired. And it's really a profound list over the course of the last several years, but particularly in the last two. We've been able to use whatever cash flow we generated from our core business to be able to fund acquisitions of work in process technology, and also incubating from the ground up organic developments that bring a sort of digital empowerment and make it available as an antidote to big tech, right? So big tech right now is in the news a lot. It's being talked a little bit by some of the folks on Capitol Hill that have characterized it as being partisan, or that it has some bias. Some would say that it's very much in the world and also of the world. And for those of us who choose a different path, that can be a little bit troubling, right? So what's the antidote to big tech? How do we basically break out of that? And I think we're playing a meaningful role in formulating what that looks like, right? What's the off-ramp from big tech? So that's one big theme. And then I would break it down in a more entrepreneurial sense. We have one project in particular that TechCrunch covered last Friday in a news piece, and that project is called Toki, TOKI.com. And the idea of Toki is that it will allow the internet to be delivered to the nominally 2+ billion people who currently have no internet. We actually have built an engine, a small server, a microserver, that has the ability to take a snapshot of the internet and store it on $100 microservers that can serve up to 500 concurrent users running on battery for up to 2 days. And in so doing, bring all manner of knowledge and soul-saving truth, but not just through the lens of Christianity, but from the perspective of asking questions and seeking answers. And that project is one that enthuses me greatly. And to the extent God's providence manifests, that would allow us to go and procure these servers on a very large scale. The framework is in place to bring a sort of digital content community and commerce to the far edges of civilized world. Rough term, but you get my point.
Yeah.
Telecom infrastructure isn't there. The disposable income to buy expensive internet devices isn't there. But nevertheless, many of them have second, third, fourth generation smartphones that are Wi-Fi enabled, and therefore they have the ability to download a document and carry it home to their community. And so even to the extent that we can essentially create these sort of wells, but not of water, but of knowledge, and then make that economy self-sustaining. The literal manifestation of a digital currency called a toki that is earned into existence by operating the toki server. So it's a mind-blowingly ambitious project, but I'm drawn to do it, and it's just a fascinating project.
So let's say someone who has young children saying, the future, what should I have them concentrate on? What should I have them study? Now, my audience would automatically know that the Bible would be the underpinning of whatever the child was to study. But based on your vision of the future and the things you're working on, what should people encourage their children to pursue?
Well, my favorite interview question that I'm allowed to ask because it's my company, but probably wouldn't pass muster with certain audiences, being what gift did God give you, right? And so I think the answer to the question about what should a youth pursue is very much steeped in the self-awareness of what gift did God give them. And as parents, to a certain extent, we get a chance to observe that our children have different gifts. They have different dispositions. They have different things that inspire them. But especially we get to see the things that are easy for one and hard for another. And I think that to the extent that we give children and young adults, the latitude to choose their path, obviously, praying for them. But, I don't know how many people were praying for me when I was a kid. My grandmother, I think, was, and I think maybe a few others, but it wasn't a long list. I have a lot of people praying for me now, but it wasn't like that before. So I would say that as a parent, it really comes down to inspiring. I'm not the one that has a strong sentiment towards surveilling our kids for everything that they do or don't do. I don't think that the strictest boundaries necessarily develop the most courageous kids. But there is a balance, right? And right. So trust but verify. So I'm not a permissive parent. I wouldn't characterize it as that at all. But I would say that inspiring kids to figure out the thing that they are great at because God gave it to them, and then encouraging them to refine that to a point of mastery where they can share their gift with humanity, because they're able to produce vastly more than others that are in their peer group because they're blessed with this gift. And I would say I made a career going back to, many decades, even before I was born again, of figuring out the thing that was being developed in, say, some laboratory or in some experimental state that played to the given strength or gift of that individual, assembling those individuals so they were able to play to their strengths, and then inspiring them to celebrate each other's success, right? I mean, that capacity as a manager is, I think, the same thing that allows great coaches to produce great teams that win championships year after year after year. It's not rocket science, right? Right. It just requires enough care and consideration to deeply understand what drives that individual and how do you array those particular qualities in a cohort or group that is capable of rising above itself, where the group capacity is of a level that maybe sets a new bar for output and accomplishment. Right.
Right. It's funny. I could translate what you said into how I often orient homeschooling families that I have the opportunity to mentor, is that just remember all the avenues you were allowed to take, and those avenues convinced you that they were the wrong avenue and you turned around. If you provide a foundation and you inform the conscience and the intellect of your children, and you encourage them to pursue those gifts, I think a lot of things play to that as being a benefit and they don't have to take all those years between the time that, modern culture says they're trying to find themselves. Well, you find yourself in Jesus Christ and you move on from there. And I think the future for people who go through a homeschooling situation is that they have the opportunity to make that kind of exploration.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. To the extent that the curriculum that is being developed by some of the ambitious, kingdom-minded education initiatives, I'm working with some of the team from the Kingdom Education Fellowship, Vishal Mangawati, and his efforts, and what is being assembled there. And I think it's built on, to a certain extent, that foundation and the desire to kind of unleash human potential, but very much from a position of kingdom orientation. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the very near future, again, because of the policies that are being rolled out due to COVID, if we have a surge of people participating in online education, not just the initial surge from people seeing their schools close, but maybe even a second wave from people who would choose, for whatever reason, to not participate in mandatory vaccination programs, or whatever the different unique circumstances of that household and what conclusions that they have drawn, that you will see many, many more people taking advantage of some of the initiatives that have been developed over the last many decades of alternative ways of inspiring people to learn in a kind of Socratic way, empowered by technology, where they get to learn the things that they're most passionate about, while at the same time rounding it out with things that are kind of essential to be able to participate in a modern economy.
And if you think about it, what happened in the first century AD was that as a result of the biblical perspective and the Great Commission, you had people developing educational models, health and wellness models, business models, guilds, things like that. And so maybe, just maybe, these opportunities now, the more dissatisfied people become, they start asking the question, well, why is that even something government should be doing? And the free internet will allow people to have community with each other, exchange ideas. So to me, this is very exciting. But I have to be honest with you, Rob, I understand about like a third of how the internet even works. I'm just glad that God gave people on our side, as I like to say, who understand it way better than I do.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to the layers of the internet, there are components that, when you kind of peel back the layers of the onion and review each layer from the perspective of what are its vulnerabilities, it becomes possible from a step-by-step approach to be able to consolidate all of those layers into something that is harmonious, that has consistency of governance and consistency of ownership, and to a large extent that's what we've done. So when you look back at why all of the attention from the media on Epik, apropos your earlier comment, it's partially because the sites that we empower, they stay online, and that has been obviously by God's grace, but also by virtue of the technology choices and the various components of technology assets that we've been able to assemble. Right? So it's a very interesting time to be in a position of empowering digital sovereignty on a really large scale, and that includes the essential point that you've just referenced, which is education. If you control the narrative, and if you control perspective, ultimately you can control policy and outcome. And the case in point that we're, I think, dealing with right now is the state of the First Amendment and the right to free expression, and those who wish to take it away. And so, to the extent you can take it away and control the narrative, you will, in rapid sequence, see other civil liberties that Americans and other democratic republics have taken for granted for centuries. They could rapidly collapse, and that's why it is so essential that the people who have the ability to hold the line, that they do their level best to do so. And in our case, that has also meant being extremely careful about governance and ownership, and to whatever extent we can maintain our independence as a supplier for the technology that empowers people to share their truth and provide their pieces to the puzzle. Every day we get to do that, I think, is another day of progress.
Right. I have the question always, okay, so there are places you can go like Epik to make sure that you're not deplatformed, but ultimately we're all talking about the internet, who owns it. And I guess my good theological answer is, of course, God owns it because he owns everything. But is there a entity that could shut down the internet as opposed to just deplatforming people?
Well, it's a very interesting point, and one that we thought about quite a lot. So we have an initiative called Resilient Domains, and you can see it at epik.com/resilient. And it summarizes our technological approach for extreme resiliency. Let's say, for example, that churches and their websites were so-called null routed, where the ISPs, the Comcast of the world, decided, okay, we no longer like these churches or any church, and therefore we will null route them. That's an extreme scenario that might sound far-fetched, but when you look at it through the lens of Orwellian dystopia on a Fahrenheit 451 Ray Bradbury level, it's not implausible that it would happen in the digital age. So the saints will do exploits, and I think that's the essential role that we all have to play in these times, is to envision the technology actions that could be taken by a quote-unquote adversary, and juxtapose that against the countermeasures that might be available to us. And ultimately, to the extent that you believe, as I believe, that Satan is controlled opposition, he's the corrections officer of the universe, then to whatever extent certain websites are taken offline because of censorship, the ones that are supposed to come back online will have the benefit of the exploits by the saints that will allow those sites to come back online so that they can continue to do the work that they were supposed to do.
Yeah.
Why I view this project as so essential, the
Right.
Epik Resilient project, because it will, I believe, empower the people that need to be routed, that even in the face of the most draconian forms of adversity, by the people who are in a position, theoretically or practically, to turn off certain elements of the internet, that they will still be able to punch through, but it will not be in the old school quote-unquote sneakernet fashion, where you're literally moving diskettes from location to location. Now it would be SD cards or USB drives, but none of that will be required to the extent that technology opens up new possibilities. I had a call yesterday with a group that is doing something quite interesting, and it has been a topic I've been looking into for a couple of years now, which is to what extent unregulated frequencies like ham and other frequencies, technologies that God allowed, right? God designed the universe in such a way that ham was possible, that Wi-Fi is possible. All of these things that are a reflection of physical laws that God designed are also in place for unconventional delivery of information. Right now, we have this mindset that says if you cannot put a cell tower in a certain location, that it would therefore a priori be out of reach for people in another part of the world. When in fact we know that we can broadcast ham frequencies across vast distances over thousands of miles. We know that whales communicate underwater over thousands of miles. So the technology to be able to deliver a message, a digital message, the same technology that God designed that allows David to play the harp and cast out evil spirits from Saul is the same physical law that allows the transmission of data in the key of A, right? Or for example, right? You see my point?
Yes, I do.
There's an amazing thing that exists in sound and in light, which manifests in the form of wave that have amplitude and frequency and all this stuff that we forgot from 10th grade physics. All of that know-how has the application for the ability to transmit data over distances and through matter, including walls.
Something you just said, I can see the homeschooling families out there, or even the families who have their kids in Christian school, thinking, maybe the thing about my child that drives me crazy is actually genius, the things that my child sees or considers or what ifs. So to me, it sounds like if we provide a good foundation in a biblical world and life view, understanding what God requires and what is sin and how not to sin and things like that, by the time these people with all these great ideas and maybe just a little bit different than everyone else will be ready to join on this really exciting technological future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, God is on the throne. He works in mysterious ways. He has a fantastic sense of humor. I've experienced it. And, the kid that plays way too many video games, on the one hand, it might drive mom and dad absolutely crazy until they contemplate the possibility that gaming community where their son, probably not their daughter, but hold out for the possibility of a gaming daughter. I don't know that many of those. That the gaming community that they are interacting with is also a mission field, right?
Right.
And most people are not thinking about that. But you imagine the number of people who are dealing with anxiety and depression, and they're anesthetizing their pain with distraction, what I think a psychologist might call stimming, right? The idea that you distract yourself with some repetitive exercise, or you self-medicate in the form of this, that, or the other. All of those people, if left to their own devices, for the next 20 or 30 years, might find that they wasted their lives. On the other hand, for all we know, the 17-year-old gaming enthusiast who spends way too much time mastering a particular video game or internet game or multiplayer, this or that, may in fact have some meaningful role to play, and they need to allow for the possibility that so long as they're being productive in society and they're getting their schoolwork done and their grades are okay, that the fact that they are doing this high reflex game for more hours than probably should be possible, it may not be completely destructive, right? It might actually be usable by God, and we should be cautious not to completely throw that stuff out the window. Doesn't mean I'm a fan of any of those activities. I'm just saying that we need to also allow for the possibility of God working in mysterious ways, and that it doesn't have to be an entire curse. It might actually be useful.
Right. When you equated what David did on his harp with, being able to transmit data, I'm sure there are people who think that way. That wouldn't be me. God's given me other gifts. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, as long as we start with the idea that the victory has been won and that we are blessed to be part of the fight, then really, if God is for us, who can be against us?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Enjoy the ride. It's an adventure, and it all works out.
Very good. Well, Rob, how might people, you mentioned going to your site. Why don't you give all the ways in which people can find out more now that they maybe have a pencil to write it down?
My email, rob@epik.com. I also use Telegram, which is an encrypted messenger that's quite popular these days. A username, Rob Monster. Skype, Robert Monster, and phone number 425-765-0077. Lots of ways to get a hold of me, and I always enjoy hearing from people in the body of Christ It's always a pleasure to discover what people have been thinking about and imagining new possibilities for the body of Christ to walk together in the digital age.
Excellent. Well, thank you again. And thank you, listeners. Join me again next time for another episode of the Out of the Question podcast.
Thanks for listening to Out of the Question. For more information on this and other topics, please visit chalcedon.edu.